Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Scarlet Cavern, an alien sci-fi harem adventure. By Michael Dalton. Narrated by Mason Lloyd. Chapter 1. I came out of a gray fog of unconsciousness to find myself lying on my face. Under me was a layer of loose, sandy dirt. My head throbbed. Groaning in pain, I reached around to the back of my skull where the throbbing was the worst. I felt a sizable lump, but my hands came back clean. There was no blood. That was something. I looked up, realizing that I was on the floor of a cave. The area around me was dimly lit from an opening overhead. Gradually, the fog began to fade, and I remembered where I was and what had happened. I sat up slowly and spent a few moments assessing my injuries. My back ached, and it seemed like I had struck my shoulder and left arm on the rocks. A lot of me hurt, but nothing appeared to be broken. I stared upward out of the darkness. I'd fallen at least 10 feet, bouncing off the sides of the cave on the way down. There was an old, gnarled tree root near the opening that was likely what I had hit my head on. A light rain fell through the hole, and the smooth walls of the cave were getting wet as they caught the drops. Climbing out would be difficult in the best of circumstances, which these definitely were not. I checked my phone. Nothing. There was no signal down here. As my head cleared, I looked around for a way out. There was a boulder I could get my feet up onto, but from there I could not reach any handholds. Every time I tried to climb out, I found myself sliding back down the slick rock. I tried jumping toward the tree root, but even after I took my backpack off, it stayed at least a foot out of reach. I had a decent amount of climbing experience, but I had no gear and my skills were fairly rusty. My ex-wife, Jacqueline, hated that hobby of mine, and I hadn't done anything serious in at least 10 years. But rusty or not, no amount of skill can compensate for a complete lack of purchase. I had no rope, but maybe there was some other way to haul myself out. I dug through my backpack for possibilities. I decided that the rainfly on my tent might be long enough to reach the opening. I tied a rock to one end and tossed it up. All it did was bounce back down. After several tries, the problem was clearly getting it to hook securely onto something. What could I use? After a moment or two, I had an idea. I spent a few minutes tying my tent stakes together into a makeshift grapple. That worked. The first throw easily caught on the tree root, but when I put some weight on it, the aluminum stakes just bent and came free. 2 hours earlier, I'd dropped my kids off with Jacqueline. Now I was at the bottom of a hole with no way out and no clue what to do. That seemed about right. It fit pretty well with the rest of my life at the moment. "Bye, Daddy." I hugged my 6-year-old daughter Cassie and stood up as she turned and ran to the doorway, where her mother had already scooped up her brother Hunter. Jacqueline and I exchanged the same look we did every time I dropped my kids off, me pretending to be civil, and her pretending I had any reason to be. "I'll see you next week, guys." Jacqueline gave me a polite smile and a quick wave. "Bye, Will." Behind her, her husband Richard looked my direction, but I ignored him as I always did. We rarely ever spoke, not that there was much to say after he broke up our marriage. It still gnawed at me that their affair had gone on as long as it had. Part of that was on me. I had been willfully blind, trusting her excuses and explanations long after I should have gotten suspicious. I walked back to my car as they went inside. Jacqueline and I shared custody, and I'd had the kids for the past 4 days. She had them this weekend, so I was going out of town on a campout. Because when your life sucks, One way of dealing with it is coming up with a new one. I was heading off for 3 days up in the mountains with my live-action role-playing group, hiking around the Cleveland National Forest. The rest of the group was already on their way to our campsite, but I told them I'd be late because I had to drop my kids off with Jacqueline after work. The idea was part role-playing, part camping, and drinking in the woods. Since we would be on public land, we'd planned it as a low-key affair so as not to alarm people, just the 7 of us, dressing up and rolling dice as we hiked up and down the mountain. The trip from Jacqueline's house up into the Laguna Mountains above San Diego took about an hour and a half of driving through mesquite and scrub oak before the pine forest began around 4,000 feet. I finally turned off the state highway into the parking lot just after 5 o'clock. I bought a Forest Service pass at the gate and found a parking place near the trailhead. There were a few people there, but I tried to ignore their looks as I got into costume. Our current campaign was a fantasy steampunk pastiche, and I'd envisioned my character as a sort of samurai artificer. Part of my outfit was a replica katana I bought as a divorce present for myself. It was a well-made Chinese knockoff rather than anything authentically Japanese, so it wasn't period correct by any means. The blade was simple carbon steel instead of traditional tamahagane, but it looked nice and honed to a very sharp edge. Since our LARPing was about role-playing rather than mock combat, it didn't matter that I was carrying an arguably deadly weapon on my back. The rest of my costume consisted of a suit of armor I made in my garage. In-game, it was supposed to be green dragon scale plate armor, but it ended up looking more like a green stormtrooper suit, minus the helmet and gauntlets, only less neat and symmetrical because I'd made it by hand, piece by piece, over 6 months, out of colored carbon fiber and epoxy resin. Although the end result was fairly rough, my attempts to create a scale-like surface hadn't really worked. I was proud of the effort I'd put into it. It worked well enough as armor without being too heavy for hiking, and the green carbon fiber looked reptilian enough for my purposes. Once I was suited up, I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started out. Our campsite was about 3 miles up the trail, where the rest of the group was presumably waiting for me, patiently or not. I hadn't been to this particular spot before, but I had a trail map, and our game master assured me it was well marked and not hard to find. The trail was level for the first half-mile before I reached the spur leading up to our campsite. From there it was a fairly steep series of switchbacks going further up the mountain. I leaned forward and just focused on the climb. Once it dawned on me that my marriage was over and I could start dating women who weren't determined to make me the most miserable person on earth, I made a concerted effort to get myself back into dating form. And like lots of people dealing with a major emotional upheaval, I went completely overboard. I revamped my diet, started working out and running, and when I felt up to it, joined a local CrossFit gym. I went on the long-distance hikes Jacqueline had never liked me doing. I started rock climbing again. I even got back into the martial arts I enjoyed as a teen when I earned a black belt in Shaolin karate and weapons my last year of high school. I definitely got myself back into physical shape. After a year, though, I was still putting off the emotional work. Getting my six-pack back was no help when I was still an emotional mess. I had dreams of dating and screwing all sorts of hot girls in their 20s, but I got nowhere trying to make it happen. This was largely because I could never figure out the right approach to online dating, and I was using the few women who connected with me as unpaid therapists. In a year, I managed 4 dates, none of them repeats, and no sex. So when a friend of mine mentioned his LARP group, I'd been into role-playing games as a kid, too. The prospect of a fantasy world off in the wilderness seemed attractive. I'd been playing with them ever since. Maybe I'd figure out something up in the mountains, maybe not, but it was something to do besides stare at the walls of my apartment. I got myself into a steady pace, where my head was emptying all my work and love life crap behind me, and I was feeling a bit overly proud of how fit I was now when I heard a distant rumble across the valley. Shit. Our GM had warned us that the weather forecast predicted a chance of rain that night, but being the bold adventurers we were, we'd decided to tough it out. And as I looked out toward the ocean, there was definitely a squall rolling in. I stopped to dig a poncho out of my backpack and threw it over myself. I got another quarter-mile up the trail before heavy drops of rain began to fall. It wasn't a downpour, but the trail and forest around me rapidly grew wet. I slowed my pace to avoid slipping, but I had a good pair of hiking boots, so I kept going. A few minutes later, I encountered a split in the trail. I stopped to look at the map, but I was pretty sure where I was, and no branch was apparent. Which way was I supposed to go? Both trails were thin and led off beyond my sight. One angled uphill, the other slightly downhill. I looked for tracks from my friends, but the rain had obscured whatever might have been there. After thinking it over and not wanting to get any wetter, I chose the uphill trail, deciding that these were likely two branches of the same trail that came together further ahead. The trail took a sharp turn up the hill, and I was soon clambering up a half-buried pile of rocks. I was about to turn around when I got to the top and saw a clear trail leading down the ridge. I paused to enjoy the view inland and noticed some kind of cave about 10 feet down the other side. There was an opening in the hillside about 4 feet across, leading down into darkness. Caves were fairly rare up here, but not unheard of. This one didn't look terribly interesting, even if I'd had the time to check it out. I turned to continue down the trail, but the cave had distracted me enough that I misjudged my next step. What I assumed was solid ground was in fact a loose stone that gave way under my foot. A split second later, I lost my balance with all the gear on my back and fell backwards onto the hillside. I reached out to my sides, trying to gain some purchase, but the muddy ground slipped away under my fingers. As I slid faster down the slope, I realized I was heading straight for the cave opening. I shot my arm out toward a dead branch on a tree I was passing and caught hold of it, only to have it snap off in my hand. I slipped rapidly down into the cave. Something hit my head, and everything went black. Chapter 2. By the time I concluded that climbing out of the cave was impossible, it was starting to get dark. I'd been yelling for help every few minutes, but no one appeared to rescue me. A cardinal rule of wilderness survival is that if you get lost, you need to stay put so people can find you. The further you wander from where you were supposed to be, the more area they have to search. I knew that, but I was now wondering if there might be another way out of this cave. If I couldn't get out the top, maybe there was an exit below. I promised myself I would just go and see. That was when I found another problem. One of my personal inside jokes, and when you're a divorced single dad, most of your life is inside jokes no one else gets, was that there was always something I forgot to bring on a campout, no matter how much I planned and thought things out. And this time, in worrying about all my LARP gear and getting the kids to Jacqueline's on time that afternoon, I'd somehow forgotten one of the most basic elements of camping: my fucking flashlight. What to do? As it happened, I did have another source of light. My GM had agreed to let me bring a green laser pointer as a stand-in for a magic wand my character owned, and unlike my flashlight, that was safely packed away with a spare lithium-ion battery. It wasn't as good as a real flashlight, but the laser pointer succeeded in lighting up the cave just enough to see where I was going. There was a passage behind me that narrowed down a bit, then curved around to the left into the hillside. That wasn't a great sign, but after packing all my stuff up again, I went to check things out. The cave floor further down was the same loose sand I had landed on. Clearly, a lot of things were blowing and washing down here over time. But the passage continued and leveled off, though I had to climb over and around several large boulders. The green illumination of the laser gave everything an eerie cast at first, but gradually my eyes got used to it. I hadn't come very far, but there was still no sign of an exit. This appeared to be some kind of cavity that had opened up in the granite of the mountain. A friend of mine was a geologist, and I knew that, geologically speaking, this range was very old. Maybe the endless shifting and faulting in the area had cracked things open at some point. Then I came around a bend and found myself in a larger cavity that sparkled with crystals. Veins of some kind of crystalline material were shot all through the walls of the cave, sending irritating laser reflections all around me. And despite the monochromatic green light from the laser, there was some strange effect that caused the crystals to glow with bright red fluorescence. Yet before I could assess what I'd discovered here, my heart sank. I looked ahead and saw a solid wall of rock blocking any further progress. Or did I? A wave of disorientation swam through my head. I blinked, and there was a passage continuing on in front of me. What had I just seen? I rubbed my eyes, and it was still there. Maybe the apparent wall of rock I thought I'd seen was just a reflection from the dust I kicked up clambering through the cave, confused by the concussion I'd likely given myself falling down here. And when I stepped forward to see what was beyond, I let out a laugh of triumph. Up ahead was light. Wherever I was, I'd found a way out. I left the crystals behind and climbed quickly forward. The cave began to open up, and the light ahead was brighter than I expected. The clouds must have cleared already, and maybe this cave was catching the sunset. The air on this side was colder, no doubt because of the brief storm. Then I caught an odd scent on the breeze, something floral. The exit was low, a hole in the wall about 5 feet high and 3 across. Still wondering how bad that concussion might have been, I dropped down to my knees to avoid the top of the hole and crawled out into the sunlight. I blinked again. What I saw were not the ponderosa and lodgepole pine trees I'd left behind at the cave entrance an hour ago. They were something else. They were trees, I suppose, but the bark was deep green instead of brown, and it glittered in the sunlight like the crystals in the cave behind me. Above me, the branches spread out in a not unfamiliar pattern, but the leaves were long, bluish-green ovals. Large red flowers studded the branches, and little white insect things flitted around them. They looked like butterflies, except for having 6 wings instead of 2. That was about the moment I realized that the sun was not setting. It was up in the sky above me, higher than when the storm had swept in. I looked at my watch. It was 6:15. It should have been dark by now. Was I hallucinating? Was I actually back in the cave in a coma? Feeling a bit silly, I pinched myself, but of course nothing happened. The ground below me was moist and spongy, not the dusty, sandy soil of the Laguna Mountains. I looked back at the sky. Not only was the sun in the wrong place, something about it looked wrong. It looked smaller somehow. It was hard to tell for sure, not being able to look directly at it, but the after images it left on my retinas were at best 2/3 the normal diameter of the sun. It was about the same brightness, but smaller. Just to satisfy my curiosity, I pulled out my phone. There was no signal, not that I'd expected one. I rubbed my eyes and then my head. A concussion seemed like the most likely explanation here. I was obviously hallucinating. That being the case, the last thing I ought to be doing was continuing my hike, since I could easily walk over a cliff if I wasn't seeing things clearly. I decided to go back into the cave and sit down, away from the bewildering landscape in front of me. I hadn't noticed it coming out, but there were more crystals on this end of the cave, some large enough that they protruded from the walls. I took a look at one of the crystal clusters. It was almost a foot across, part of a vein running back into the tunnel. That was when I got another shock. The passage I'd emerged from, the passage that presumably led back to where I'd fallen in, was gone. The cave now ended no more than 15 feet inside. Where the passage had been was now a fractured wall studded with crystals. I went over and felt around. There had been no rock fall closing the passage. There was no sign the passage had ever even been there. I sat heavily down on a rock, bewilderment flowing through me. Hunger suddenly gnawed at my gut. I realized that no matter what I was looking at, it was well past dinner time. Maybe eating and a little rest would clear my head. We had divided up the food for the weekend amongst the LARP group, and I had my share of it in my backpack. I took my pack off and found something I could justify eating right now. I spent a few minutes forcing it down with some water. My hunger was satisfied, but my head did not clear. When I walked back out, I realized with a shock that the sun had actually risen in the sky. And if my bearings were not completely screwed up, and this was the opposite side of the ridge I'd fallen down, I was facing roughly northwest toward the ocean. That meant the sun was moving back over my head, in the exact opposite direction it should have been going. I pulled out my phone and opened the compass app. I wasn't sure what would happen, but it got a reading on something. The compass needle spun around, indicating that north was actually off to my left. That made no sense, but I couldn't get a GPS fix to figure out what was going on. I clearly could not go back, since the cave was closed off. Maybe I could carefully explore a bit and see what this area was. There was no path I could see, but the trees were not especially dense, so the going was easy. I was on a slope of some sort. Behind me was a hillside above the cave entrance. I decided to climb up. Maybe I could get a better view of the area. I hadn't gone very far before I heard something. Somewhere off to my left, behind a group of the strange glittering trees, I heard something crashing around. There were cracking and scraping noises, followed by an unmistakable growl. I froze. Mountain lions were the one real threat in this area when it came to wildlife, and they would definitely stalk humans if given the chance. But normally they were quite stealthy. They were ambush hunters, so whatever was going on, it was not about me. Then I heard a cry. I almost wasn't sure what it was, possibly a hawk or something else, or a rabbit the mountain lion had caught. But something about it sounded vaguely human. I didn't like the feeling of being weighed down by all my gear if there really was a mountain lion nearby. I popped loose the buckles on my backpack and set it down. But unable to resist my curiosity, I stepped slowly and quietly forward into the clump of trees. After a few moments, I saw what was going on. The source of the growl was reasonably feline in form, but it was not a mountain lion. For one thing, it was black. For another, it had 6 legs. But it was angry, and it was after something up on the wall of rock above it. Huddled in a small alcove, I saw a pale blonde-haired girl holding some kind of knife. She was trying to stop the creature from jumping up to get her. "Hold on," I yelled. "I'll try to draw it off." A moment later, I realized the mistake I'd made. The mountain lion thing spun around to face me. I was going to draw it off, for sure, because it was now coming in my direction with a very hungry look in its eyes. The girl yelled something, but I couldn't catch it. It hadn't even sounded like English. As the beast began closing in on me, I suddenly remembered that I had a weapon to defend myself, my katana. I reached back over my shoulder and drew it from its scabbard. The creature sprang at me much faster than I'd expected, and I only had time to bring up the blade in front of me. I slashed down as I tried to dodge it. There was an ear-splitting screech as the katana bit into its flesh. At the same time, I felt its claws scratching into my LARP armor. The breastplate held, but I felt a burning in my thigh as a claw dragged between 2 of the plates. We fell apart and faced each other. The wound I'd given it was not as serious as I hoped. I'd opened a gash across its shoulder, but it did not seem seriously injured. I took a moment to calm my nerves. I'd seen combat before. I had enlisted in the Marines after high school and served 2 tours in Iraq. So this was far from the first time I'd been face to face with something that wanted to kill me. But in Iraq I'd been part of a unit with a lot of support. I'd never had to fight a wild animal alone with little more than my bare hands. Granted, there was a time in my youth when I was fairly handy with a shinai, the bamboo swords used in kendo, but that was a long time ago. The look in the creature's eyes told me only one of us was getting out of this alive. I thought of my kids and decided it was going to be me. With a shout, I lunged forward and struck at the creature. It hadn't been expecting me to attack, but it reacted immediately, rearing back and swiping at me with its two front paws. This time I struck hard, opening a large gash down one of its forelegs. But its claws caught the edge of the greave on my left shin, nearly tearing it off. I fell back. It sprang at me again. I wasn't ready to strike, and I could only block it with the end of my katana. I fell over and managed to avoid being pinned, but it was on me immediately, snarling and snapping its jaws at my face. I kicked out at it, trying to get away. I realized that as fearsome as it looked, it was not that big. The average mountain lion weighs about 150 pounds, and this thing seemed lighter. I was 6'2" and almost 200 pounds, which meant I had a size advantage I needed to use. I wedged a foot under it and shoved, pushing it off of me and over to the side. It landed on its wounded foreleg and let out a yelp. That was enough time to get me back on my feet. It sprang again, but this time instead of striking with my katana, I kicked out at its face, connecting my hiking boots squarely with its jaw. It let out another yelp and fell to the ground, staggering backward and regarding me murderously. The beast's jaw was now crooked and uneven, and it opened and closed its mouth as if I'd broken it. Not waiting for it to make a decision, I lunged forward again, striking down at its head. Still stunned from my kick and with a wounded leg, it couldn't dodge me fast enough, and my blade bit deeply into its neck. The beast let out a scream and fell to the side, kicking and lurching with its good legs to try to get away. I struck again, kneeling as I did, and nearly severed its head. It jerked and was still. I tried to catch my breath as the adrenaline began to subside. My heart was hammering in my chest. I wiped the blood off my katana using the creature's fur and sheathed it. Then I sat down to assess my injuries, trying to get my mind around the absurdity of having come up here to roleplay only to end up actually fighting for my life. As it turned out, my fake dragon scale LARP armor had held up pretty well. There were 4 not terribly deep scratches across the breastplate, and my greave just needed to be strapped back down. The scratch on my thigh was nowhere near as bad as I feared. The creature's claws had torn my hiking pants underneath, but the bleeding was already starting to stop. That was when I remembered the girl. Chapter 3. She was still squeezed into the hollow in the rock wall. "Are you okay?" She yelled something at me, but again I didn't understand it. She was speaking some language I didn't know, or maybe just babbling. I walked over to the bottom of the cliffside. She was about 10 feet up, having clearly scrambled up to avoid the mountain lion thing. She yelled again. "What are you?" Several things struck me at once. First, what? Not who. What? The second was that, though her voice and speech sounded the same as it had before, I understood her now, in a way that made the bump on my head throb. My name's Will. I'm kind of lost." She looked down at me, not responding right away. I got a better look at her now, and my forehead wrinkled in confusion. For a moment I wondered if she was part of some other LARP group that had gotten lost like I did. For one, her hair wasn't exactly blonde. It appeared to be dyed or tinted in some way that made it appear like long strands of silver and gold, which shimmered in the sunlight over our heads. She was wearing purple costume contact lenses, and she'd put some kind of fake points on her ears. She was pretty, beautiful even, with fine features and sculpted cheekbones, though I couldn't quite tell how old she was. Anywhere from 18 to 30. "Do you need help getting down? That thing is dead." She shifted her feet, not moving to come down. She still held tightly onto her knife, which also looked like a costume piece. Not metal, more like a strip of plastic. "Thank you. The Busang found me by the river. I only just reached this cliff in time." Again, her words made no sense to my ears, but somehow my head still understood them. Even the meaning of Busang, though it had no English analog in my brain, was clear. A fierce, flesh-eating cat, albeit one with 6 legs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?